Hello, HIN 620. This is all about Chapter 7, how to code subqueries. Hopefully by now you've read a little bit about this and aren't thrown off by the complicated sounding word of subqueries, because it's something we've actually all done before. It's, basically just making a select statement within another select statement. And I find these actually very easy to work with because you can run the internal select statement, or the inner select statement, and see what it returns, and then put it into the outer select statement, and you know what value it's going to return. So it's a lot easier to work with them and a lot easier to debug them. The one thing about it that you want to keep in the back of your head is that the entire select statement needs to be enclosed within parentheses if you do that. We'll see that in an example. One thing just to quickly discuss is that the difference between joins and subqueries is that with these joins, you can select, in your select, you can include columns from both tables, whereas in the subquery, you can't do that. And for, as I just mentioned, for complex queries, it's a lot easier to write them out and break it into pieces and then put it back together again. Another thing that's kind of interesting that really won't affect us are the data, the magnitude that we're using for the upcoming project, but the subqueries are slower, but they are a lot easier to read. So, that's sort of the pluses and minuses. One of the other things that you should take away from this chapter is how the correlated versus uncorrelated query. It's not really something you're going to be actively thinking about when you're looking at extracting data, but it's good to know the difference between the two. And what I'll do is I'll show you an example of a correlated query. And so the subquery contains a reference to T1, even though T1 is not in the select statement, so it's correlated to the outer query. And if you were to look at a similar query that is uncorrelated, you see that it only uses a reference from T2. So that is the difference between the two, and it's not a terribly complex concept. And like I said, it's you're not going to be walking down the street thinking, geez, how can I write a correlated or uncorrelated query? It's just that the query either is or isn't. So one example we can go through to look over the topics of all and any and exist, which are keywords that you can use in your query for subqueries. One of the ones that I use very consistently, because it's convenient to know whether you have any at all or none at all. So it's either an exists or a not exist. In this situation here, we're looking at give me the ID, name, and state for any vendors that don't have any invoices. So it says select star from invoices where vendor ID equals vendors.vendor ID. And so that's going to give all the invoices for any given vendor ID. And then you want to say, give me the vendors that don't exist in there. So if we run that, we see that we get 88 rows of vendors that didn't have an invoice in the system. So that's a good example of being able to use the exist keyword, and the any and the all are very similar to that. I wanted to highlight something that I thought was really good in the book about the building complex queries. Queries can be as long as you want them to be. They can go on and on. I'm sure there's some theoretical limit, but I've seen them go on for pages, and they just keep returning data and filtering the data. So it talks about building a complex query, and as I've mentioned previously, is that it helps to just kind of state the problem in English. Just don't don't try to run right out and make select statements out of it. And then once you've got the I want to select these vendors who have these invoices, that sort of thing, then just kind of map it out on a piece of paper using what's called pseudocode, which basically means anything other than actual code that you're trying to write. And then, as I mentioned before, you code the subqueries and test them to make sure they're returning what you want them to return. And then as you build the query together, each piece should return the part that you want them so that the whole thing actually does. I just thought that was a really good way of kind of laying it out. So now we'll move on to the exercises. So let's look at exercise 2 from chapter 7, which is a really good example to pull apart and see how it works. The question is, write a select statement that answers this following question. Which invoices have a payment total that's greater than the average payment total for all of the invoices with a payment total greater than 0? So if we take the last part of it, where what comes after greater than, so the average total payment for all invoices with a payment total greater than 0. So if we pull that out, put that in here, so there's the average payment. So what this is the inner information that we need to extract, which is the average payment total from all the invoices where the payment total is greater than 0. So that's going to be the inner query or the subquery. And if we put the rest of the stuff around it, where we're trying to select the invoice number, invoice total, and invoices where payment total is greater than that inner number that we just calculated, and then we can order it and run it. And it returns 20 rows, just as it should. And if we move on to exercise 6, write a select statement that returns the name, city, and state of each vendor that's located in a unique city and state. In other words, don't include vendors that have a city and a state in common with another vendor. So if we, again, devise an inner query, the subquery, we're going to concatenate the state and the city and group them by group them by that concatenation, and then say where the count is greater than 1. And so that's going to give us all the ones that are have non-unique city and state combination. So we're going to then wrap that in the outer query, which says, again, concatenate state and city, and then say not in. So we're saying I don't want the ones that have the duplicate, non-unique city and state. And then we end it by an order, and we get rid of that excess line, and we run it, and we get the 38 rows that we're supposed to get. So that's it. Enjoy, and we'll move on to chapter 8.